Back in the 70s, board games and improv theater had a baby, and it was called the Roleplaying game. These games allowed a generation of kids to live out their dreams of slaying dragons and saving kingdoms, all while sitting in their bedrooms and basements. Today, gaming has moved into the cultural mainstream, and role-playing games are back with a vengeance. Join us now as 5 of these former kids come out of the basement and onto the internet to experience adventure, mystery, and obscure pop culture references. It's time for Roll for Combat!
Hey everyone, welcome to Roll for Combat. I'm your GM and host, Stephen Glicker, and in a special episode this week, I sit down and talk with James L. Sutter. James L. Sutter is the co-creator of the Pathfinder and Starfinder role-playing games, and from 2004 to 2017, he worked as an editor and a developer at Paizo Publishing, and he was there ever since Dungeon Magazine. He was also the executive editor of the Pathfinder Tales novel line. Although he no longer works for Paizo, he does have a new book out. Paizo just released his brand new adventure, Firestarters, which most of you probably know is the first adventure in the Starfinder Dawn of Flame adventure path. James and I sit down and talk about a whole bunch of topics, as he is a legend in the industry. We talk about his long career at Paizo. We talk about what it was like actually creating Starfinder. We talk about what he's working on with the next version of Pathfinder. We talk about what he's been doing since he left Paizo. We talk about various book recommendations he has. We talk about what it was like in his first day at Paizo. We go all over the place. And of course, we talk about Distant Worlds, which was written by James Sutter back in February 2012, which outlined the solar system of Pathfinder and was indirectly related to, well, Starfinder and what you have today. Anyhow, for those of you who are interested in Pathfinder, for those of you interested in Starfinder, for those of you interested in the history of the game, for those of you interested in Pathfinder version 2, we got a little bit of everything for you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the interview. Hey everyone, Steve here. I got a special guest. I have one James L. Sutter. He was the co-creator of Pathfinder and Starfinder, and he is now, well, freelance. But he has come to join me to talk about some Starfinder, talk about Firestarters. We'll probably talk about Pathfinder, Pathfinder 2, his bands, his secret projects, his not-so-secret projects. We're just going to talk and see where it goes. Hello, James L. Sutter, right? L.
Yeah. Hey, glad to be here.
So you're telling me a silly story about you're not James Sutter, you're James L. Sutter, because you need to make sure that everyone knows that you are actually the James Sutter, because even your Twitter handle has the L in it, I believe.
Yeah, well, I mean, so nowadays I'm fortunate enough through Pathfinder and Starfinder and other stuff to have risen in the Google rankings. But when I was first starting out, I actually wasn't the most prominent James Sutter on there. And one of the other James Sutters was this guy who was this like horrible anti-Semitic preacher, but like I don't know much about him, but apparently a bunch of people really hated him to the point where there was a website called exposingsutter.com that was, it was exposingjamesutter.com, and it was dedicated to sort of like talking about this guy and all the terrible stuff he did. And so I kind of looked at that and went, I really need to make sure that I distinguish myself early. So I got the L in there, and then it just stuck, which, I like it. Adding that middle initial always feels a little distinguished, right? Even if it does mean that half the time people type my Twitter as James Slutter. It happens.
So you're like James T. Kirk, only James L. Sutter.
Exactly. Trying for that Shatner-esque gravitas.
What does the L stand for, if we may ask?
Oh, it's my middle name. It's LaFond. It's actually my mom's name, and that's the family that I'm closer to. So it's also kind of one of those things where it's a nice nod to that LaFond clan that I'm part of.
Why don't you give a little history? I'm sure a lot of people know who you are, but you're not with Paizo anymore. You're now in the freelance world. But before that, you were like the heart and soul of Pathfinder and probably Starfinder,
Well, I
since
don't
that was your
know.
baby.
I don't know if I was the heart and soul, but I was definitely one of the people helping hold things together for a lot of years there. Yeah, so I was at Paizo for 13 years before I went Ronin, I guess. And yeah, I started there when I was 20, actually, and worked my way up until I was working on Dungeon Magazine as an editor there. And then when the magazine licenses went away, I helped found Pathfinder. I was one of the original people developing that world and that game, from the original Adventure Path on through the role playing game and whatnot. And continued to work my way up there into higher and higher positions. I did development, I did editing, I did a bunch of different stuff. I started up the Pathfinder Tales novel line, so I was the original person in charge of that, in charge of commissioning all the authors and getting, editing the books, developing them, that sort of stuff. So I got to run all of that while still doing managing the editorial department and doing development and stuff too. And then eventually, when the time came to work on Starfinder, it's something that a lot of us had been thinking about for a long time. It seemed like sort of a natural outgrowth. But I had been fortunate enough to write a book called Distant Worlds a few years earlier, where I got to design the solar system for Pathfinder. And so I'd always, since the very beginning, I'd been the one trying to sneak science fiction a lot of the time into Pathfinder stuff. I mean, so I wrote the original gazetteer for Varisia in Pathfinder #3. Like James Jacobs had developed, he'd drawn the map and he'd developed Varisia for his home game, but we just needed a ton more locations. Like his was pretty focused on a few key points. So I got to put in a bunch of new adventure locations and cities and stuff. And when I first did that, he and Wes Schneider had to kind of sit me down because they were like, look, it's not that you're wrong, but you can't put a space elevator in Varisia. Like this is not that type of game at this point. And so I sort of ramped it back, but the science fiction element had always been something that I was really into. When Erik finally said, hey, like it's time to pull the trigger and do Starfinder, yeah, I think a lot of people were really interested in it, but I talked to him and talked to folks, and it kind of, for a variety of reasons, I got put in the creative director role. And so I, partially because the setting was going to be based heavily on Distant Worlds, which had been my baby, but also just because I had been one of the people, along with Wes Schneider and some other folks, who were kind of the top editorial management there, holding things together. And so if we were going to build a whole new department, I was the person who got the nod to run that. So I spent about 18 months running Starfinder, putting that all together and leading that team, and then sort of all the way up through the launch. And then, it had that Gen Con. It was amazing. Like the game just, busted out. It was like being a rock star at Gen Con. I'm not going to lie. It was really fun. And then I came back and I said, all right, I think I'm done. I think I quit. And everybody went, what? What do you like? How could you possibly quit now? Like this game is a runaway success. But I just felt like, for a variety of reasons, I felt like after 13 years at the company, it was just time to go work for myself and spend some more time focusing on creator-owned stuff. Like, novels have always been my first love, and I got to write 2 of them while I was at Paizo. But I just found myself, there were so many writing projects that I was having to turn down or put on hold. And at the same time, I was also, the thing about being a creative director is, on the one hand, you get a ton of creative control, and that's awesome. Like you get to make the calls. At the same time, you're fundamentally a manager. And so very little of my day was spent writing about dragons or spaceships anymore. And so combine that with also some stuff that was going on in my personal life, and it just made sense to leave on a high note and let Starfinder be sort of my swan song, right? I always think about Bill Watterson and Calvin and Hobbes and how he kind of like left at the high point when everybody was still wanting more. And I felt like, that's what I want to do too. So I left, and the team has been going strong since then. Rob McCreary took over as creative director, along with Amanda Hammond, I think, is the managing developer on it, and then Owen, Jason Keeley, Joe is now on the team as well. The team's been doing awesome, and it's been really interesting to watch. Now I guess it's been almost a year and a half since I left, and that's a weird feeling, but I'm still, while I left the company, I'm still playing in the sandbox. I still freelance for Pathfinder and Starfinder, and it will always hopefully be a part of my life, but now I just have so much more time to work on other stuff as well.
And I'm sure if you ever really got the itch to go back to Paizo, I'm sure they might bring you back if you ever wanted to, I don't know, come out of retirement, so to speak.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's one of those things where, it's been really fun to go back. Actually, one of the things that's been great since leaving is no longer being the creative director of Starfinder means I actually have more time to write for Pathfinder as well. Like, I've been able to do some writing for Pathfinder Second Edition, which I never would have had time to do if I was still the creative director on Starfinder. And one of the things, actually, the very last book that I outlined before I left the company was the Pact Worlds book, the big Starfinder setting book. And that book was such the heart of what I love about Starfinder and about gaming. I'm a setting guy first and foremost. And so that book in a lot of ways really confirmed for me that I was doing the right thing, because as I was outlining that book, I was thinking, oh my God, I would love to write every part of this. But due to being Starfinder creative director, I have very little time to actually write for this. I only got to write, a few pages out of this book where, if I had had the time, I would have loved to write that thing cover to cover. Right. And so I think that really made me feel like leaving and allowing myself to be open to more freelance projects was really the right thing to do emotionally. And it let me do, like, for instance, Firestarters, the first of the Dawn of Flame adventure path. That's an adventure that I probably couldn't have written if I was working full time as the creative director. So in a way, it freed me up to do more actual writing for Pathfinder and Starfinder.
So you're telling me the secret of being able to actually write more for Paizo is to quit Paizo?
I mean, kind of. I don't know if other people would find that true as well, but certainly I think my freelance ability has gone up since then. Now, that said, also, I'm not going to lie, it's weird being out of the company and suddenly realizing, like, oh, when I was on the inside, as creative director, I could just assign myself whatever assignments I wanted. And now, I get what assignments are left over after the other people pick the stuff they want, right? Or stuff that they think I'd be particularly good for. But it's interesting that after so long, I feel like I'm proving myself all over again. I'm working for, like, on the Pathfinder side, I'm working for new developers that have started since I left. So they've actually hired a bunch of people in the last year. And so it's very strange to go back to the office of this company that I was at for so long and be like, there's people here I don't know. There's people I'm working for that I've never met. And, like, to them, I'm just some rando, and so I have to, like, prove myself from the ground up as if I were a complete stranger. So hopefully I'm doing it. Hopefully people are happy with the stuff I'm writing.
I don't think you're some rando. I think you're that rando. You're like, oh, it's that
yes,
guy. He
yes,
used to work
yes.
here. I know him, or I've heard of him.
Highly credentialed rando.
Right, a credentialed rando. But that is fascinating. I have heard that before, though, because it's like when you work there, you have to do so much that writing, it's ironic. It always happens too in business. Like when you get promoted, if you do something really well, you usually get promoted to the point where you're no longer doing what you were doing well. You're now in charge of people doing what you were doing, and you never get to do it anymore. So
Exactly.
yeah, you basically were really good at writing, and then you end up being in charge of everything, and then you never get to write. So you leave so you could write. I've seen this before.
It's true. Although, I will say, like, I loved being a manager at Paizo. I felt like, like you say, some people end up getting promoted into a job they don't really want. I actually loved being a creative director and loved writing or loved working with people, just because talking to people is is my other favorite thing to do. And so I feel like I was able to really be of value in that group, like of being a person who, when you've got a bunch of incredibly talented creative people in a room and they're all ready to kill each other, trying to be the person to, weave that together and make sure that everybody's working together, is actually something that I find deeply satisfying. But at the end of the day, I had to sort of step back and say, like, look, what is it that I want to look back on in 20 years and have done more of? And the answer is, I want to have written more novels, more comics, more game books. I wanted to be putting more words onto paper. And so in order to do that, I had to give up some of the, being inside the sausage factory, which I really did enjoy.
Well, now you have your own baby sausage factory. When you get to create your own.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Now I am the sausage factory.
That's right. So, boy, man, I don't even know where to start. I could probably talk to you for hours because there's so much I want to ask you. I guess we'll start with the basics. We'll go through Dawn of Flame and Fire Starters. So that's the new adventure path. You wrote the first adventure where you guys, well, they go into the sun? Like what? Mm-hmm. It's one of these things everyone's been talking about, but there has been very little information about it because they're like, what do you mean you go into the sun? Can you explain the archipelago and how it's all set up? Because even that, people just, well, since you also are the Pack Worlds guy, tell us all about how people live on the sun in the world of Starfinder.
So the deal with the Burning Archipelago is when I was first designing the solar system, I was trying to think about how to lay out the book, and I realized that I actually had a little bit of space left over to talk about the sun. And I had been really inspired by there's a book called Sundiver by David Brin. It's a classic science fiction book, but it's about this idea that maybe the sort of life that seeded life on Earth actually is this progenitor race that lives inside the sun. And I had always thought that was a really interesting idea. And so I was thinking, well, what could exist inside the sun? And so, obviously most of what lives inside the sun is creatures that are adapted for that sort of environment, plasma elementals and weird stuff from the plane of fire or the plane of positive energy, that kind of stuff. But I wanted to have at least some alien creatures that are a little more like, humans that live there. And so one of the things that I put in there is this thing called the Burning Archipelago, which is an artifact. It's like a bubble city inside these magical bubbles that like maintain a habitable region inside the sun itself. And nobody knows how the technology works. When people found it when people from the Pact Worlds found it, they were already abandoned. And so they settled in there, especially, of course, the Church of Sarenrae is going to say, oh my God, we could live inside the sun. Like, what better place for a center of the church of the sun goddess than inside the sun? But a bunch of different people live there, scientists studying it, wizards, etc. And so that's sort of the Pact World's foothold in the sun. But there's always been this question of, are there other cultures and creatures that live deeper in the sun that we don't know about yet? And in this adventure path, you're going to find out.
Yeah, when I read the original Distant Worlds, I remember going through it and seeing all the cool worlds. And then I saw the sun, and then there was a whole thing about how there's creatures that live on the sun. I'm like, what? What? Are you kidding me? There's creatures that live on the sun? Like, you expect to have creatures on the other planets, but that one even took me for a loop. I was like, huh. I guess so, but it was...
But why not, right? You've got the plane of fire. So, like, you've got all those creatures that live in a dimension entirely of fire. Like, a sun isn't that different, right? So we kind of ran with that.
I guess it makes sense. And it's one of those things that a lot of these, adventure paths you can kind of figure out, or, like, there's some... I don't know, I would say, like, parallel. Like, oh, you're going to an undead world. Okay, that's cool, but... And, I've seen that in movies and stuff. Or you go to a jungle planet or you go to a water planet. But the sun, it's like, wow, no one's done that. Like, it just doesn't really exist in literature or fantasy or anything really. It's like, huh. And it's fascinating. It's definitely out there. So I guess you hope you did some good world building there.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. It's hooked you. And this was an interesting one for me because obviously I did found some foundational work on the sun and things of that nature, but the whole outline for this AP was created after I left the company. So I was coming in. The Starfinder creative team made the whole outline. They figured everything out, and actually they had a pretty solid outline for even the first adventure. When they contacted me, they knew what the adventure needed to do to sort of set up the next 5 adventures. So it was actually pretty, I wouldn't say it was all planned out, but they had a lot of things that they knew what they needed. And so in some ways that was actually really nice because it meant that I often find that I work a little bit better with some constraints. If you give me a blank canvas, then I might get paralyzed thinking, well, I could do anything. Versus if you give me a few things that have to be in there, then I can, just sort of build around those things. Hopefully, I would say like the grain of sand that, an oyster uses to make a pearl, but that seems pretty precious. So maybe it's more like an improv sketch where you tell somebody, all right, you've got a banana and a shoe and your mother-in-law, like make a scene. It was a lot of fun to work on that, and I was really glad that they gave me the chance to do, among other things, I got to do a Starship dungeon, which I was really excited to do.
And the Starship dungeon starts off, I mean, now there's some spoilers, but it starts off pretty quick. And the map is gorgeous. I mean, whoever did that map,
thank you,
a beautiful map.
Thank you. Well, so
you didn't draw that. You didn't draw that.
I didn't draw it. I drew the turnover, and then Damian Mamolidi did the actual cartography of it. But it was super fun to draw the sketch for that map because I'm drawing a starship, but also a starship that's basically a dungeon in terms of how the players are going to experience it. And so, spoiler warning for everybody, spoiler, it's a starship from the plane of fire. And so trying to design a magical starship was really fun, especially with like, what does an Efreet themed starship look like? And also I got to sort of figure out what is the aesthetic of, starships from the plane of fire. What should they look like? And actually, Chris Sims, the lead developer on the whole adventure path, was nice enough to, when I turned over the map, he said, oh, this is great. We'll make sure that future Efreet starships have this same sort of aesthetic. So we worked together to kind of build, because that's one of the things I love about starships and Starfinder, actually, like all the way back in the core rulebook, the idea that there are different sort of styles of starships. They don't all just look the same, but like you can tell the difference between a Shirin ship and like, a human built ship or, a ship from the Xenowardens. Like you've got these different aesthetics that I feel is really important to making sure you have a fun, interesting game, especially when starship combat is part of it. But yeah, so that getting to design that dungeon starship was definitely my favorite part of writing the adventure, and I'm glad that it hits people right away because I think it's does a good job of being like, if you like this is the sort of thing that you're going to get more of.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now, and I play online, so I actually have to turn the maps into interactive like maps on our tool set, and there's so many corners. It's like when it's square, it's really easy to input the map, but there's so many rounded edges and curves and 45-degree angles. Man, this thing is going to be, if I ever run it, it's going to be an absolute nightmare.
Oh no,
to a VTP, but
that's one of the things.
But it looks cool.
Thanks. Yeah, that's one of the things about doing a starship map is trying to figure out that that point between, in real life, things are not designed to work with 5-foot squares, right? Like, and so trying to find that blend of having some rounded things, having some corners that aren't perfect, but also trying to make it so that you minimize the number of squares that are affected, right? And so like for me it was about, okay, well, let's find the general shape of the starship, and then let's stretch it in Photoshop in these different ways and see how can we get the basic idea but get as many normal usable squares as possible, so that it's a little bit easier for GMs. But yeah, in terms of putting it online, that's a whole different challenge.
It kind of reminds me, and you probably remember this. So I played Age of Worms from beginning to end, and it was
Oh
either
yeah.
yes, how about that? And this was either the third or the fourth adventure. I forgot which one it was. Took place underground. I don't know if you remember that. And that dungeon was insane. Like there was no straight lines. There was cliffs. It was 3-dimensional. And I remember like just even trying to draw it out was a nightmare, even just on regular graph paper. And afterwards, my players were like, that was the best dungeon we've ever been in, because it just was so freaking bizarre. Like, it
Right.
wasn't straight corridors. It just
You gotta be
just
creative. People love it.
right. Well, it was like an actual cave system, like a real cave
Yeah.
system. And I'm trying to remember which one. It was either the third or fourth. It was in the early parts of it wasn't obviously it wasn't the first one. It wasn't the second one.
Yeah. Well, that actually, it's interesting that you mentioned Age of Worms, because that the Whispering Cairn, the first Age of Worms adventure, was the first thing I ever edited for Paizo. That was when I was 20 years old, and I had just started working for the company. I had cold called Lisa, basically, Lisa Stevens, out of nowhere, and just said like, "Hey, I see you're hiring for an editor in chief for Amazing Stories. I am totally not qualified for that job, but like here's what I can do. Here's what I've done. I'd been doing journalism for a little bit at that point through college, and so I said like, hey, do you have anything?" And she brought me in for an interview and said like, hey, we don't have anything, but I like your moxie, basically, and so I'll see what I can find. And so I ended up, my first job at Paizo was finding images for the new Paizo.com web store at a nickel a JPEG. That was my job. But I used that to wrangle my way into an editorial internship. And that editorial internship started with pretty much the first day. Erik Mona walked over and slaps down this big manuscript in front of me and says, "All right, you want to edit? Edit this." And I said, "Cool. What? Who wrote it?" And he said, "I did." And so I went, So my first job was editing my new boss's own manuscript. But apparently I did a good enough job that he kept giving me more to edit. And then that was how I became sort of the intern, and then, eventually an editor on Dungeon, and on from there.
Man, I think we might have to do this interview in multiple parts, because I can go on about this, because I've said this on the show. I do segments, and I had my favorite dungeons of all time, and I have number one is the Whispering Cairn, especially for low level. I think it's the best dungeon ever written, especially for level 1 through 4. It is absolutely fantastic. I love that.
You should have Erik on to talk about how he wrote it.
I have. I actually have.
Well, then there you go.
But and I'm not the only one, because last year at PaizoCon, was it Lewis? He converted the Whispering Cairn for Pathfinder 2 and ran it because he loved it so much. There's a lot of people out there who know, if you know that dungeon, because it's so freaking cool. So if you edited it, that means you must have the original somewhere, right? Do you still have it? I would love to
not.
Oh, come on. I'd love to see the unedited version of that.
You wouldn't believe how much stuff. Well, at that point, I didn't even have a desk of my own.
I heard,
right?
I heard, because it was supposed to be like 20. The original, Erik told me he wanted it to be 20 adventures, the Age of Worms, but they had to cut it down to 12. I'm sure it was like probably twice the size. I would love to see like what it originally was.
Yeah, and it's interesting that so many people have so many fond memories of Age of Worms. I mean, obviously I do too, and it was a great adventure path, but I think it was also, it wasn't the first adventure path, but I feel like for the people who sort of I think of when I think about who was around in the beginning of Paizo, and to be fair, I was not in at the beginning of Paizo. Like, Paizo had been going for a few years before I came on board, but I feel like Age of Worms was the first adventure path with sort of that team of like, you know, Erik and Jacobs and Wes and Bullman and me and some other people, like that team that would go on to do a bunch of other stuff, including Pathfinder. I feel like Age of Worms was when all of that band got together and kind of gelled. Right. And like that's around I feel like that's around when like Sarah Robinson came on the art side as well. And like, Sean Glenn, who was the original Pathfinder art director. Like there were a bunch of people coming together. And even though the magazines had been going for a while, like I think for some folks that was the point where a lot of things clicked.
Yeah, I mean, the first one was The Shackled City, which was okay, but that's just the concept because I've been playing D&D since, 77, and my biggest problem with D&D is like the adventures were like our bread and butter. That's everything that we always liked and we always played, but there was no real connective tissue. And then Dragonlance came out. Remember that? And Dragonlance
Oh yeah.
was okay. It had some issues because you had to have the pre-written characters and you had to play them, and it sort of was like, well, it wasn't like true role playing. It was almost like you were part of an adventure story. So it was kind of there, but not quite there. And it was even weird that you started off at like, I think the level 3, I think you started off. And so I remember I was talking to someone and they told me about the Shackled City. And I was like, oh yeah, it takes you from like level 1 to 20. I was like, what? Are you kidding me? It's one adventure that goes all the way. I'm like, sign me up. And I went to go buy Dungeon, and sure enough, that's when Age of Worms was just starting. And I was like, all right, let me sit down. And I read Whispering Cairn, and I remember sitting in my apartment in Manhattan reading it. And I was just like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing I've ever read. I'm like, I'm running this immediately. And we ran it. And that adventure path there's nothing like that. That adventure path, I remember Erik said, he's like, okay, think of the coolest things in the history of D&D. All right, we're going to put it into this adventure path. You got, let's see, the rod of 7 parts. Yeah, we got that in there. Fighting beholders, sure. Fighting mind flayers, sure. Get taken over by a doppelganger. Yeah, we got that in there. Meeting Tensor. Yep, we got that. It's like every single Hand of Vecna. Yeah, we got that in there. Every single cool thing possible in the history of D&D is in one adventure. It's fantastic.
Yeah, right. And and it's funny because that really it's hard I do not want to discount the trailblazingness of Shackled City, right? Because like that was the adventure path that, sort of started the idea of adventure paths, and the folks who came up with that idea, that's amazing. And I actually worked on when Paizo published the compiled Shackled City hardcover. That was my first publishing. That was the first time I got my name in a masthead for a gaming product, was as editing on that book. So like Shackled City has a huge place in my heart, but I definitely feel like that sort of established the idea, and then Age of Worms, I feel like, really sort of ramped it up and started getting the flavors of a new crew in there. And then of course there was after that there was Savage Tide. Yeah, obviously there were many reasons I really liked that, but that was also the first time I got to write for an adventure path, so that was huge. Actually, Wes Schneider, it was also his first time too, so we co-wrote the Adventure of the Lightless Steps, and that was our first dungeon adventure path module. So there were a lot of firsts back in those days. We were all really young and very excited and figuring stuff out, and making of course making big mistakes, but also making big just huge leaps forward in terms of our own creative abilities as we figured out how all this stuff worked.
And now it's sort of become the staple of Paizo. They come out with a lot, obviously, but the adventure paths are like the bread and butter. Like that's like,
Yeah.
that's what they're known for. That's what they come out with every single month. I mean, heck, when Starfinder came out and you did Dead Suns and one adventure path every 2 months, and people went crazy, including myself. I'm like, not enough. It's
Yeah,
simply
right.
not enough. Even if you're not going to run them, just to read them.
Well, and that was like many things with Starfinder, that was a really strategic decision that we agonized over. But we had to. The thing about Starfinder is we could never have come out the gates with Starfinder having as many offerings as we did for Pathfinder. Like, we just didn't have. We would have had to double the staff size. And instead, like Starfinder, the thing with a game like Starfinder is you have to ramp up and make all of these books before you make any money from those books. And so how do you afford the 2 years it takes before you actually start seeing any money from that? And so we really had to carve, resources out from the existing Pathfinder, engine in order to make Starfinder go. And it was incredibly challenging. Like those 18 months of making Starfinder, of launching Starfinder, were far and away the most challenging time I ever had at the company. More than the magazine transition, more than launching Pathfinder, more than launching Pathfinder Tales or anything like that. Like, that was just a brutal gauntlet for everybody involved, and everybody really, rose up and did an amazing job. But we had to make some really strategic choices, and so that played into what went into the core rulebook. It played into the decision to make Alien Archive the size that it is. It played into the decision to make the adventure path volumes a little bit shorter, and also to have them be bi-monthly instead of monthly. A lot of it was just about what is feasible, but also what is enough, right? Because you can't come out with a game and just put out one book and then be like, and we'll be back in 6 months with another book. Like, you need enough for people to play. And so we really had to figure out, like, what is enough that the game feels supported, but how can we do it, like, A, without killing everybody involved, and B, without sacrificing quality? Because it was really important to, like, if we're going to do this, like, we need to do all of these projects right. Like, the core rulebook itself was just God, I don't even know what the word for it is, but like, when we originally sat down and talked about what needed to be in the core rulebook, I took in everybody's insight, what management wanted, what everybody on the staff wanted, and talked about, like, what is vital to be in this book. And I sat down and paginated it out, and it's like, that's 1,000 pages. We cannot, there's no way we can even print a book that large. So figuring out what could be cut or what could be boiled down and distilled, both in the core rulebook itself, but also in the game, was really important. And so I think the result is a core rulebook that I'm super happy with, because I feel like we did manage to play to kind of everybody's hopes and give people really a tremendous amount of stuff, but in a very condensed, boiled down package that means that there is no wasted space. Like, every page in there is vital because we squeezed it as much as we could. Because, right, like, when you think about it, you think Starfinder is almost as complicated a game as Pathfinder. Okay, well, the Pathfinder book is, the size that it is, 576 or whatever that is. But then also we wanted to have more introductory material to walk people through character creation and everything. And also we wanted setting material, and we wanted to put that in there. And also, clearly, we need starships to be their own, like, miniatures game. So that needs to be in there. And so I'm really proud of the fact that we managed to do as many things in there as we did.
Yeah, I actually do want to talk to you about the history and creation of Starfinder, because it's been over a year. I think it's safe, and you don't work for Paizo either, so we could talk about this.
I can talk about it. I can't talk in an official capacity, but I can tell you about the stories from when I was there.
You could tell it's just between you and me. No one else is going to listen about the
yeah, right.
of Starfinder. But that's what I've heard. I heard that Jason Bowman said that it's like the book was like 800 pages, I think, even just written. And then you guys had to cut it down and which must have been horrific to get it down to like 500 and like whatever 550.
Well, it's one of those things. The process of cutting down and like it's not just cutting, right? Like that was one of the big things. One of my sort of philosophies going in is like it's not about cutting it down; it's about boiling it down. Because when you boil something, if you simmer a sauce and boil it down, the flavor gets stronger, right? Like, and that's what I wanted. It's like, and I find this is often true in my own fiction writing and stuff as well. Like, you write the thing in the way you originally do it, and then you say, okay, I need to cut 20% out of here. And in doing that, you get rid of the chaff, you get rid of, the anything extraneous until what's there is just the best it can be. And obviously, there was some stuff that we just couldn't afford to get into. Yes, there was a lot of stuff that we needed to really sort of boil it down, and some stuff didn't make it in, right? Like Eric's originally wanted there to be monsters in there, or actually I think several people wanted there to be monsters in the book, and that just wasn't going to happen. But so that's why we knew we had to do the Alien Archive sort of as soon as possible. But I think that in general, could we have made that book 1,000 pages? Absolutely. But I actually think that for the most part, the game is stronger from us having to make those hard decisions and saying, what is a more concise way to do X, Y, and Z? In part because one of the other goals going into Starfinder was to make it as robust as Pathfinder, but a little bit simpler and easier to use. Like, we wanted people to have lots of options, but we also just wanted it to be a slightly easier game to come into, because I think that Pathfinder, like Dungeons and Dragons before it, was really one of those games where, especially with the Pathfinder core rulebook from first edition, like, you kind of needed a friend who knew how to play to teach you how to play. Just sitting down with it, it didn't really walk you through in the way that somebody who was totally new to role-playing games would need to. If you already knew how RPGs worked, then it was fine. That was part of why we did the beginner box for Pathfinder, which was very successful. And we tried to take some of that ethos and include that in the Starfinder core rulebook and really sort of help ease people into it. And I think it really helped. And I think that that also, between you and me, at the time, nobody knew about Pathfinder Second Edition, or nobody outside the building knew about Pathfinder Second Edition. But we were also very aware, all of us, when working on Starfinder, that this was a chance for us to experiment with different things to see how they would work for Pathfinder. And so I think that in Pathfinder Second Edition, you're going to see a lot more of that sort of a focus on how to get newer people into the game, right? Like, it's not just about the math and the damage curves and everything. It's about making the game fun and easy to just jump in and start playing.
I mean, yeah, one of the fun things about Starfinder, which is really different than Pathfinder, and I actually just had a conversation with Erik Mona about this the other day, is that Pathfinder, in the end, is fantasy, and fantasy has a lot of baggage with it. It obviously, everyone thinks, okay, you're going to have elves, you have to have dwarves, hobbits, trolls, dragons, like, all this stuff. And then Starfinder was able to kind of be goofy. It's funny. It's not Star Wars, it's not Star Trek, it's more like Guardians of the Galaxy, and some of, it's
Totally.
it's kind of a goofier version, and it's just fun. It just allows you to just be more relaxed. You can kind of goof around more. And I don't know if that was on purpose or just by accident, or, if it was something you were aiming for. But when we play, it's always like kind of like we're always on the edge of goofy. It's always like,
yeah. I mean, I think that the having fun with it element is definitely something that we were all really going for. Like, when in doubt, definitely one of the guiding principles was like less simulationist, more fun. And I think we even say that. I'm pretty sure I wrote that somewhere towards the front of the book, where it's like, really and truly, kind of rule zero, all these things, just have fun with it. And if something, you're not going to, for instance, in the starship combat section, like, we don't have rules for throwing, or we didn't we didn't at the time have rules with like using starship weapons against people, adventurers on the ground in ground combat, right? Like you can't just nuke every dungeon from orbit. And like, is that simulationist? Does that make sense? No, but it's way more fun because fundamentally we don't want this to be a game about dropping rocks from orbit. We want this to be a game about, going down and exploring alien dungeons and things like that. And so we made a conscious choice to just say like, look, the rules don't allow you to do this thing because we don't think you'll have fun. And I think that, it's very easy in game design to get into a mindset where it's not okay to say that. But I think it's really important to say that. Like, the goal here is to have fun and tell a story. And if you're getting so hung up on, well, that's not how that really works, you're not going to have a good time. Sort of in the same way that I feel like there is a tendency that I sometimes see in role-playing games that I don't really see other places, which is this idea of if a rule can be twisted around to break the game, I must use it to break the game. And I've never understood that, because to me, the game is about telling a fun story. And it's not about winning and losing, really and truly. Like, I love it when my characters die, as long as they die, in fun ways, right? And so I feel like that mentality of we need to make everything ironclad or else somebody is going to use it to break the game. I would much rather say, like, look, I'm here to give tools to people who want to have fun rather than protect against the one person who is not going to play nice. That's my personal perspective. Now, I know that, as I often found out, that is a very hard line to have with when you've also got like an org play program or various other things. So I totally get why it's important to write very, very consistent rules. But pushing for fun and adaptability and versatility was sort of one of my roles. I wanted a game that you could be very silly with, but also that you could run a horror game. Like, I want you to be able to play both, Spaceballs and also Event Horizon. Like the system can do both.
So I'm very curious to know about the very beginnings, because I heard a rumor, and I forgot who I was talking to about this, and I asked, when did you guys decide you were going to do Starfinder? And they said 2 weeks before PaizoCon, and when we announced it, which means you had to like do everything because you had to get into the printer and like in like 9 months or something crazy like that. You had to get everything written, tested, laid out in an insanely short amount of time, which backs up what you were saying that it was like super hard when you had Starfinder.
Yeah,
like,
I can't remember if it was exactly. I can't remember if it was exactly that timing, but it was very close before PaizoCon. But yeah, we had about a year start to finish from we should make this game to this game is going to the printer. And that is, a lot of people will tell you that is not enough time to do a game like that. And those people would be right. And we knew it, but we also knew with the timing of second edition and some other things, like we knew that if we were going to do Starfinder, it was either going to be right now or we'd have to wait like 5 years to do it. And so Erik made the call. I mean, Erik along with the other managers, but him as publisher, most importantly, made the call that like, hey, we're going to do this. And it was a death march. I'm not gonna lie. It was a really, really hard schedule, but we made it. A lot of people pulled a lot of long hours and got some gray hair, but we did make it through. And I'm really proud of the game that we made. But like, I will say that it was by the skin of our teeth. Like, we rewrote the entire way abilities work, like ability scores. That was rewritten like the day before we shipped the book.
Yeah, I heard that things were being rewritten over and over again to the point, like I've heard the stories that things are just like constantly being rewritten, that you would come up with something, test it quickly, and then like, no, that doesn't work, rewrite that. Or like, I can't even remember, I've heard Owen talk about systems that were in the original rules that just never even came close.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely different things that had to get revised, right? Because, it's a big game with a lot of different interlocking pieces, and you can't do it all simultaneously, but we had to do a lot of stuff simultaneously. And so you'd be, writing System X while System Y is still being developed. But the two are, integral to each other. But I think the most strenuous one was the ability scores thing. That was the only thing that was like, at the very last minute, we had thought everything was fine. And then I can't remember, I think it was Amanda Hammond who was like, we need to do some extra play testing of this internally. And she got a bunch of folks from the customer service department and had them make characters, and they hated it. They like, we'd done all this other testing with other people, but it just happened that when we gave it to the customer service group, like they said, no, like we rage quit. This was not fun. And we went, oh crap. Like, and so we sat down and had like some emergency, meetings where we said like, how are we going to change this? And I think, as I recall, and it's been a couple of years, so my brain's a little bit fuzzy, I think that sort of Amanda raised that alarm. We panicked a little bit. We went to the design team. Stephen Radney McFarland had a good idea about how to change, like about a totally different way to handle ability scores and how they would work while still working within the mathematical models. And it was an idea that they'd thought about, but then discarded because it was not, like, they felt that it wasn't quite as elegant or whatever. And I said, no, that's good. Like, we think people can use that. So we took that idea, we iterated. Like, I went in my office and closed the door and like wrote up his ideas into what is now the ability scores section of the book, right? Like, I wrote those couple of pages and the examples of how to make a character. And we went out and we hammered on them, and then they went into the book, and the next day the book went to print. So it was really a last possible minute thing. But that's the version that's in there now, and people liked it. So
I can imagine that is that you were doing so much testing that people didn't really make characters from beginning to end correctly. You were probably just throwing characters together for testing, and then could have been that, well, when you actually went through the process like you were supposed to, then you found out, hey, this actually isn't working. Is that how it came about?
I think the problem was that it was something like, there are so many different types of gamers in any given game or game group. And so we were testing this stuff, but like that particular thing, like the making of characters, was being tested by, a bunch of gamers that were really comfortable with a lot of sort of crunchy math and whatnot. And so, we'd look at it and go, this isn't as elegant as it could be, but like, it's fine. And then we gave it to some players who were not as interested in a bunch of crunchy math stuff. And they went, this is way too complicated. Like, this is like doing my taxes. We hate it. And as soon as they said it, like, we all realized they were right. Like, there was no, there was no question. It was like, oh yeah, like maybe, there were things where there were like partial points. Like, it was very complicated, and it was elegant. Like, it, from a mathematical perspective, like, it would have given you the perfect results. But game design is that, and, I'm a little bit talking, not as, I am not a rules designer by trade. Like, I in no way pride myself on that. But like, I think that there's a very important trade-off that, that all good game designers kind of know, which is like, there's the elegance of the math and the probability, and then there's the ease of use by the player. And you really have to balance those two. And we had gone too far the one direction and had to come back and say, like, no. The important thing here is that people have fun playing the game. And if that throws the math off slightly at higher levels, what can we do to mitigate that, et cetera? But like, the important part is that it doesn't matter how perfect the modeling is if people hate making a character, right? So we had to remember that was one of our precepts, is like, this is supposed to be easy and fun.
So why don't we talk about some of your other projects? What have you been doing since you left Paizo? That's not Paizo related, because we know you're doing some Pathfinder version 2 stuff that you probably can't talk about. You said to me you had some projects that are coming out. You had some secret projects. You had a whole bunch of things that you've been working
Yeah,
on.
I've been pretty busy. I have been doing some work on Pathfinder 2. Not for the rules at all, but I've been doing some work for like the Pathfinder Adventure Path, some back matter articles. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk to them, but there was some stuff like I'm going to be working. Yeah, I probably can't talk about any of it. Anyway, I'm doing some back matter
You're
articles.
doing stuff. You're doing stuff.
Yeah, and then I've obviously, like fire starters, some different Starfinder stuff. That's been really fun. I'm glad that I. One of the things that I loved most about fire starters was that it proved to me that the team actually wanted to work with me. Right? Like, even it's a little bit weird when like you're the boss and then you leave and then then you come back being like, hey, you guys want to let me play, and then you find out whether or not they actually liked you or whether they were just listening to you because you were the boss. So it's been very nice of them to bring me back in as a freelancer. I really appreciated that. And yeah, so I've also been doing some secret projects stuff that I can't talk about for some other game companies that y'all might recognize. And then I've been doing a lot of work on novel stuff. I recently signed with a new literary agent, so I'm going to be shopping around some science fiction and fantasy novels here very shortly that I'm pretty excited about. And then I've also been doing a little bit, like I got to do some comics work for Howard Taylor has a webcomic called Schlock Mercenary that is a super long running science fiction humor strip that's been going for like, it's like every day for the last 15 years. It's a crazy amount of body of work. But he let me write a guest issue of that, which was fun. That'll be going in one of his compilations. And I also got to do some work with Tyler Walpole, who's one of the longtime Pathfinder artists, is putting out an art book for his Blood of Dragons world that he's created. And he brought me in to write some world lore for that and some little fiction snippets. And so I'm really excited for that because it's going to be just a gorgeous book. It's as a writer, I am deeply in awe of artists. And so anytime I can be in a project that's more art than words, that's pretty exciting.
And then you also told me that last year was the first Gen Con that you missed in a decade because you were in your band. Because I do know
Yeah.
you play what's the guitar? Do you play other instruments? Or
I play guitar and bass. And so I've played in various bands over the years. I've got a sort of just for fun kind of hair metal rock and roll band called Brides of the Lizard God that I play with. But this summer, actually, there's a group called Wars Outdoors where they're a theater company where every Saturday and Sunday in August in Seattle, they would perform the entirety of Star Wars A New Hope in the park. And it's this super fun kind of punk rock, like low budget, but really creative special effects. Like, for instance, R2D2 was a girl on roller skates with a slide whistle. Like it was super fun. And so I was playing in the band for that. So playing guitar, there was guitar, accordion, clarinet, and drums. And we together were playing, the Star Wars score behind the whole 2-hour production. And it was just a blast because it's free. They'd been doing it for years with Star Trek, but this was the first year where they went up to doing a full movie. And so they did Star Wars. And yeah, there were several thousand people who came to see us. It was really fun.
and something else I noticed, or one thing I should say, is that I follow you on Twitter, and you are very, very active on your Twitter account. And you put up some pretty strange stuff. I have the picture. What were you doing? You were doing the floss on New Year's Eve and some wacky. I was like, what is going on here, man?
I feel like the purpose of Twitter is to do that kind of stuff, right? Like,
But one thing you mentioned, so you're a writer, and obviously you make a living writing. So I always like to find out what other writers like to read. And John Statz is the same way, who's on my show. And I was reading some of the books that you recommended. One of them sounds amazing, but it's not out for like a year or half a year. Gideon of the Ninth.
Oh, Gideon the Ninth. Yeah.
Yeah, Gideon the Ninth sounds bizarre.
I was lucky enough to get a advanced reader copy for that. So the publisher sent me this and said, like, I think you'll like this. And it's fabulous. It's basically goth lesbian necromancers in space solve a like haunted mansion puzzle dungeon, and it's brilliant. It was really fun and kind of funny, and just like the whole take on, like, she breaks magic, like necromancy, into all these different schools, where it was like, oh my god, you could make an entire role-playing game just based on the different types of necromancy. So yeah, people should watch out for that one. But you know, I feel like actually I've been really kind of coming home to fantasy the last couple of months. I feel like for a while there, I was a little bit burned out, having just read so much fantasy, and I was reading more science fiction or more nonfiction. But I've read a number of really excellent new fantasy books. Like Robert Jackson Bennett's Foundry Side is really fun. It's like the magic system is kind of like computer programming, but imagine like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser if if the Grey Mouser were a talking magical item computer programmer. You know, I read Jay Kristoff's Nevernight series, which is I keep having all these. I do sort of like Hollywood style pitches for books that I really like, but like it was basically like Harry Potter joins a murder cult, like that. Like it's like, what if Hogwarts was an assassin's school? And so that's really fun, very sarcastic and witty. You know, like I read the Broken Earth cycle not that long ago. Starting with the 5th season, and that totally rocked my world with the magic system and just like sort of the gritty view of sort of an apocalyptic landscape that felt new and different. I feel like it's kind of rare for a post-apocalyptic novel to feel truly new. Like we've seen so much post-apocalyptic stuff, but I feel like she did a really amazing job. So yeah, I feel like, maybe it's not that fantasy is having a renaissance right now. Maybe it's just that I wasn't paying attention. But either way, there's a lot of really good stuff, and I'm having a lot of fun.
Have you read Brandon Sanderson at all?
I have, yeah. And I've actually, I know Brandon kind of casually. I've read, I really liked Way of Kings. I really liked Mistborn. Funny story. So, like, the first time I met Brandon was at Gen Con a couple of years ago, where we were on a panel together about world building, and we were going back and forth, and of course the crowd was packed because it's Brandon, but it was really fun. And so at the end of the panel, I was like, I'm gonna go introduce myself to Brandon. Like this is a good panel, it's a good opportunity. Like I'm gonna go say hi. And as I got over there and like reached out my hand to introduce myself, he was like, oh my God, I just want you to know, like, I'm a huge Pathfinder fan. It's so great to be on this panel with you. And it was like, oh, okay, then we're going to go get lunch. And so that was how I met Brandon Sanderson. But it was really funny because my first novel, Death's Heretic, had just come out. And so I had a copy, and like I gave him one. And he looked at it, and the book's about 400 pages. And so he kind of looked at it and held it up and was like, so what, this is like about 400 pages, 100,000 words, something like that. And I was like, yeah, about that. He was like, cute. Because of course all of his books are 10 bajillion pages. But he was super nice. He actually like read the book and gave me some nice comments. And so he's a good dude.
Yeah, I've met him a few times. I met him way before he was crazy popular, right in the very beginning when he was kind of starting out. But I do remember, people, I read a lot of fantasy, and people were telling me, like, Way of Kings, you got to read Way of Kings. And I've read that book. I read it, and I couldn't put it down, and I've read it 3 times. I mean, talk about world building. I mean, obviously, he's been working on that since he was a kid, but that is a phenomenal world. And his magic systems I mean, I've read a lot of fantasy, but he really goes out there. He has magic systems based on music, on light, on metal. Like he just comes up with very original stories and very original worlds. And good thing is that he's young, so he's not going to die. Unlike some of these other authors, he seems to keep.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
That's true, but it's like he obviously he finished the Wheel of Time.
Robert Jordan.
Robert Jordan died, and so he had to finish it. And we're always talking, my friends and I. It's like Fire and Ice is getting up there. George R. R. Martin is not he's not a spring chicken anymore. And it takes him 5 years to write the book. I have a feeling they have Brandon Sanderson on speed dial to have him finish up that series too, because he's like the only one who could probably do it.
Well, I had read somewhere that actually George Martin has in his will that nobody else is allowed to finish it. Like, I know the TV series will wrap regardless.
Right.
But I think that he doesn't want anybody to finish the books if he doesn't finish them. So everybody hope you get your fix.
He's got to start writing a little faster, because I read the first book. Oh my God. It's been over. I graduated college, so that was a long time ago. I remember seeing it, and the whole reason I wanted to read it is because it had a blurb from Robert Jordan. And I was like, oh, Robert Jordan likes this book. I'll pick it up and read it. And then I was like, oh my God, this book is fantastic. And well, obviously it's become like, the biggest show on planet Earth ever since. But
yeah. Well, it's a conversation that I have a lot with other writer friends about this sort of idea of like, what do authors owe their audience? The question of, Neil Gaiman famously said, George Martin is not your bitch. And a lot of authors are like, yeah, like all we as an author owe you is the book that you bought, but I really go the other direction. I feel like I've sort of come around to the idea that an individual standalone book, that if it's self-complete, if it stands alone, great. Then if a fan wants more, that's great, but you don't owe them anything. But a series, I feel like a series is a little bit of a promise. And obviously, as an author, most of the time when a series doesn't finish, it's not the author's choice. Usually it's because the publisher stopped publishing them. Like 99% of the time, it's either somebody died or the series got dropped. Like most authors want to finish their series. But I think that it's actually, while you don't owe people spending every moment of your life writing, and I think it's nobody's business, the people who get really mad, and if Pat Rothfuss posts on his Twitter like, hey, had a good dinner with the family, and somebody's like, shouldn't you be writing? Like, that's a jerk move. But at the same time, I do think it's not wrong for the audience to say like, hey, we didn't buy a self-contained book from you. We bought like the first part of a story. What we're buying is the story in installments. And like in the same way that like if you bought a novel and it was missing the last 3 chapters, you wouldn't just say like, well, this is what I got. Like, I guess this is, I guess that's the complete package, right? Because that it's not. So I feel like if you have a story like A Song of Ice and Fire, or the King Killer Chronicles, talking about Pat, like I do feel like you have an obligation to make a good faith effort to finish that thing, because everybody wasn't just buying a finished product from you. They were also investing in the series because they wanted to see the end. So I've really come around to that perspective. At the same time, I think that writing is real hard and also life happens. And like, I think it's totally reasonable if an author says, hey, I know you expected this book this year, but it's going to take me 2 more years because it's not good yet. Like, I think that's fair. But I do think there is kind of an obligation to at least try to finish a story for your people if you have that option.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Kingslayer Chronicles, because I literally was typing that up as you were talking. I was like, I got to bring up Kingslayer, because there's a very famous one, as you mentioned, Pat, because he wrote The Name of the Wind and then The Wise Man Fears, and everyone's been waiting for the third book. And he has a lot set up. It's almost like George R. R. Martin, like, okay, you really built up a lot in these first two books. So we're waiting to see how this all comes together in the third book. And meanwhile, you see him, oh yeah, I'm playing D&D and I'm going over here and at this comic convention and I'm giving all these talks and watch me play video games. And exactly like, where's the book? We like you and you're great and you're very funny and you're great on social media, but how's the book coming, by the way, Pat? Is that thing coming out anytime soon? And I agree with you. It's like, okay, we read 2/3 of the book. We're kind of waiting for the last part here, and then you can go play video games and do conventions to your heart's desire. But can you at least tell us what's going on? Because he's very tight-lipped on it. He doesn't say anything about that book.
Yeah, and it's hard, and like, while saying like, yeah, I'm totally like, I'm in that same camp of like, I think you owe it to the fans to be making a good faith effort. At the same time, like, I also think it must be terrifying to be Pat right now, right? Like, because if your first two books are that popular, like, there's got to be a part of him saying, how do you follow that up, right? Like, if you've only ever been up to the plate twice and you've hit home runs both times, how do you have the confidence to know that you're going to do it a third time? And if you don't, like, that the entire world is waiting for that next book, or at least it feels like it. And so I totally see how that could be terrifying and lead you to keep thinking it's not done, it's not good enough, that kind of thing. But, also part of the job is you got to work through that, right? Like, and if you're having trouble with that, you got to find other people that can support you through that, right? I feel like George Martin has been doing this so long that I feel like he knows how to push through and make it happen, right? But I think he's still got the same thing, right? Like, I think it's really hard to have a lot of expectations, now that said, right, like, at the same time, it's also fair to say, oh, boo-hoo, there's plenty of authors writing books that are not, that they don't know if they're going to get published, let alone have the entire world wait on them. So it's just a different type of problem. But I can have sympathy and say, still, you got to try and work through it.
Yeah, but I remember, I'm old. I remember when Star Wars came out, I was 7, and it's like, oh, we have to wait 3 more years for another movie. And back then, especially when you're a kid, and like there just wasn't this much media. There was like 3 years might have been 300 years. And then The Empire Strikes Back comes out. And then, of course, with that ending, you're like, are you kidding me? We have to wait 3 more years to find out what's going on. Like, that was excruciating. But could you imagine? It's like, okay, Star Wars comes out, then The Empire Strikes comes out, and spoiler warning for those of you who don't know, but Darth Vader says he's Luke's father, and then, okay, George Lucas is going to go do some gaming and conventions for the next 10 years. He'll get to the next movie when he gets to it. You guys just hold on to it meanwhile. But that's what it feels like. It's like you read these books and so much has been set up, and you've been reading these books and you're investing years of your life into these books that you want to see the ending. I mean, even when the Harry Potter books were coming out, I remember, thank God she came out with them at a reasonable pace, but I remember I started reading them when book 2 was out, and I was like, wow, this is really good. And then book 3 came out and exploded, and I was like, God, I hope she just keeps coming these out and make sure she finishes all 7 of them. And she did. And it's like, that's the flip side of the coin. It's like, look how satisfying that was to actually see the series all the way through.
Yeah, right. And I think that, most authors do if they can, right? Like, that's the job, and certainly that's the best thing to do PR wise. Now, I also totally understand getting seduced by the celebrity of, like, if you get really famous for a thing that's not finished and suddenly now you have all these new opportunities that are way shinier than writing. I get that, because, like, listen, I write full time for a living. And writing sucks, except when it either sucks or it's amazing. And those moments when it's amazing are always bookended by times when it sucks, right? Like, it's I really disagree with the people I see who say like, oh, a real writer, you have to like you have to write, like you can't not write. It's like, no, like most of the authors I know, it's like going to the gym. You're really glad that you did it afterwards, but in the moment, it's really hard. And you'll do almost anything to avoid it. I know so many authors where when they're on deadline, that's when their house is the cleanest it's been for months. So I get it, but part of the job is pushing through that and making sure that you're delivering what you say you're going to deliver.
If you want to hear the funniest person on Deadline, listen to Dan Harmon, because he's so bad. It's no wonder Rick and Morty take so long, that he will have pitches to do TV shows, and then he waits not to the last minute. Like, it's like, oh yeah, the pitch is in 8 hours. I think I'll start writing it now. And he talks about this like, yeah, he's really bad. He does it not even to the last second. Like, oh, I'm in the pitch, and he's literally writing that. He's infamous for this. Obviously, he's pretty successful at it, and he's a pretty smart guy. But if you listen to his podcast or listen to some things when he talks about his writing process, he never finishes things on time. But yet, it does get done eventually. He does get it out there. So.
And I mean, that's the thing that counts, getting it out there. I'm definitely the opposite, man. I always want to do stuff as soon as I can. If I have stuff like hanging over my head, it drives me nuts. But, it's like you say, as long as you're getting it done, that's what counts.
I don't know. I mean, I don't do as much writing as you do. I mean, I do some freelance for Paizo, but I have stuff that's not due for 6 weeks. In fact, I just looked at the contract and I was like, is this due in 4 weeks? And it was due in 6 weeks. And for the last couple of nights, I finished it. And I actually told Jason Keeley, I'm like, I got it. He's like, just wait. I'm like, really? You don't even want it early? I'm like, okay. I guess just polish it up. I mean, it's funny. It's the other way too. It's like, okay, I actually finished this like months early, but they don't even want it early. I guess they just don't have the bandwidth, and they expect to review it when you get it. So.
Well, speaking of deadlines, you're reminding me of all the things that I should be working on right now.
We just have to do this again because we could be talking about everything for a long time. Before we finish, are you going to be going? So, are you going to show up at PaizoCon? Are you going to Gen Con? Are we going to see you anywhere?
I definitely won't be going to Gen Con because I think I'm going to be doing The Empire Strikes Back with that same theater group. I had so much fun with A New Hope that I don't think I can skip my favorite of the movies, the chance to do that live. But I'll probably stop by PaizoCon. We'll see. Like I have not been formally invited, but we'll see. I'm sure
I'll give you an extra ticket if you need a ticket.
I'm sure that they won't kick me out.
I'm sure it won't kick you out. Well, I'm going to be running a special game there, a very special game. I can't talk about it yet, but I promise you're going to want to be part of this. So, and I get to invite who will be in this game. Good to know. And we're still working out the details, but you're going to want to be part of this game because I'm going to give a little hint. It is Starfinder related. That's all I'm going to say.
I think I might know what you're talking about.
You might know what I'm talking about, but
oh, cool.
Yeah, I'll tell you. But yes, I'm putting together the table now, and only exclusive people can get on this table. So.
Nice. Well, I appreciate the sentiment. Yeah, so I don't know. My conventions this year are definitely lighter. For a variety of reasons, I need to stick pretty close to home these days. But if anybody wants to find me online, like you say, I'm always on Twitter at James L. Sutter. Happy to talk to folks. You can also find me on my website at jameslsutter.com.
Cool. And obviously Firestarters, which is out now that you can get. And then
go play. We didn't even start talking about all the craziness that's in there, but I really am excited to see I'm excited for everybody to go play it. Maybe it's good that we didn't get into any spoilers, so go play it, and then we'll have to talk again once everybody's got opinions about it.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk again. But thanks so much, James, for being on the show, and hopefully we'll talk to you again in the near future.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey everyone, Steve here. Once again, thanks James for being on the show. I'm sure you'll be on again, as he and I just managed to scratch the surface of all the things we could talk about, as the history of Starfinder and Pathfinder is extensive, and James has been there for a lot of it. Also, if you want to perhaps meet James and go to PaizoCon this year for free, do check out our free trip to PaizoCon contest. All you need to do is listen to the show. That's right, just listen to our Dead Sons Adventure Path. You don't need to know anything that happened before episode 70. I mean, if you want, you can listen to all the other episodes, but just start listening to episode 70. We give a big recap of everything that has happened beforehand. You can just jump right in, start listening, and then all you need to do is listen to the show, answer a few questions, and then you can get a free trip to PaizoCon. That's right, free airfare, free hotel, free badge, and free banquet ticket. You too can get to go for free. All you need to do is listen to the show and then enter. And with the big announcement yesterday of the Pathfinder version 2 lineup, do look for future interviews and future information on Roll for Combat, where we're going to talk with other developers from Paizo about what to expect for Pathfinder version 2 in the next couple of months. Anyhow, with that, thanks for listening.